This is Benjamin. Today I'll be discussing the topic on crucifixion. This presentation takes its material from the paper titled Physical Death of Jesus, published in the Journal of American Medical Association 1986. Crucifixion probably began among the Persians. Alexander the Great introduced the practice to Egypt and Carthage, and the Romans appeared to have learnt of it of the Carthaginians. Although the Romans did not invent crucifixion, they perfected it as a form of torture and capital punishment that was designed to produce a slow death with maximum pain and suffering. It was one of the most disgraceful and cruel methods of execution, and usually was reserved only for slaves, foreigners, revolutionaries, and the worst of criminals. Roman law usually protected Roman citizens from crucifixion. In its earliest form in Persia, the victim was tied to a tree. That's why being hung on a tree and being hung on a cross were synonymous. I'm going to talk about flogging. Flogging was a requirement before every Roman execution. The usual instrument was a short whip. With several leather thongs of variable length, in which small iron balls and sharp pieces of sheep bone were tied at intervals. Leather thongs, sheep bones, and metal balls. The man was stripped of his clothing and his hands were tied to a post. The back, buttocks, and legs were flogged on either side by the soldiers, one on each side. The intention was to weaken the victim to a state just short of collapse or death, but not causing death. As the Roman soldiers repeatedly struck the victim's back with full force, the iron balls would cause deep contusions. The sheep bones would cut into the skin and subcutaneous tissues. Then, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles. Pain and blood loss generally set the stage for circulatory shock. The lacerations would usually be in the shape of a V-shaped scar because of the floggings. I would now discuss on the construction of the cross. The cross was made up of 4 pieces of wood. We have the horizontal bar called the patibulum, the vertical called the stripe, a seat called the sedile, and a notice board named titulus. It was customary for the condemned man to carry his own cross from the flogging post to the site of crucifixion outside the city walls. He was usually naked, unless this was prohibited by local customs. The entire weight of the cross was probably about 130 to 140 kilos. Only the crossbar was carried by the criminal. The crossbar or patibulum weighed between 34 to 57 kilograms and was placed across the victim's neck and balanced across both shoulders. Usually the outstretched arms were tied to the crossbar. The procession to the site of crucifixion was led by a complete Roman military guard, headed by a centurion. One of the soldiers carried the sign on which the condemned man's name and crime were displayed. Later, the titulus would be attached to the top of the cross. The Roman guard would not leave the victim until they were sure of death. Here are two examples of shape of crosses in Jesus' day, and here was the sign was placed, or it could be here, usually above the victim's head. In John 19:19 says, Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So this sign was displayed as Jesus was was walked through the streets in Jerusalem, and it was hung on a cross. Understandably, the Jewish leaders were upset at what was written on the sign, because that meant the crime was King of the Jews. In Matthew 16:24, Jesus said to his disciples, Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Jesus' disciples knew what Jesus meant by these words. History and culture has changed the meaning of what carrying the cross meant. I think we would do well to remember the original meaning of carrying the cross. Now I want to talk about the nailing process. Jesus was nailed to the cross. The nails were tapered iron spikes, about 13 to 18 centimeters long, and narrow, the widest being 1 centimeter across. At the site of execution, the victim was given the bitter drink of wine mixed with myrrh or gall as a form of mild analgesic. The criminal was thrown onto the ground on his back, the arms outstretched but not tight. The wrists were nailed to the patibulum or crossbar. It has been shown that ligaments and bones of the wrist can support the weight of a body hanging from them, but the palms cannot. So Jesus could not have been nailed into the palm. Accordingly, the iron spikes driven between the radius and carpals, or it could have been driven between the two rows of carpal bones. The driven nail would usually crush or sever the median nerve. This will stimulate the nerve to produce excruciating bolts of pain in both arms, very similar to a sciatica pain. Next, the nailing of the feet. The feet were fixed to the cross and usually nailed directly in front to the stipe or the horizontal piece. To accomplish this, the knees have to be flexed and rotated. The feet were fixed to the front of the stipes by an iron spike through the first or second intermetatarsal space, just distal to the tarsal-metatarsal joint. This is the nail, and in this direction. It is likely that the deep peroneal nerve and branches of the medial and lateral plantar nerves would have been injured. And as you see, the crucifixion per se, except for the flogging, was a relatively bloodless procedure. John 19:36 says, "Not one of his bones will be broken." The nails were thin, long, and usually driven between the bones, so the nailing process would not have broken Jesus' bones. The major pathophysiologic effect of crucifixion was the interference of normal respiration, particularly exhalation. Here we have two diagrams. This is a diagram of inhalation, and here's a diagram of exhalation. The weight of the body pulling down on the outstretched arms and shoulders would tend to fix the intercostal muscles in an inhalation state, and thereby preventing passive exhalation. Expansion of the chest the criminal was sitting on the seat of the cross. They will keep the chest rib cage in an inhalation stage. After some time, the person would experience increased carbon dioxide, and he would have to exhale. Adequate exhalation required lifting the body by pushing up on the feet and flexing the elbows and abducting the shoulders. Lifting the feet, abducting the shoulders. This maneuver would place the entire weight of the body on the tarsus, producing pain. Furthermore, the flexion of the elbows and the rotation of the wrist around the iron nails will cause pain along the damaged median nerves. Lifting the body was also painful as the back scraped against the wooden cross. After exhalation, the person would then relax back on the stool on the cross in an inhalation phase. So you can see that the stool was meant to prolong the life of the criminal. As a result, each respiratory effort would become agonizing and tiring and lead eventually to asphyxia. The actual cause of death by crucifixion was multifactorial and varied somewhat with each case, but the two most prominent causes probably were hypovolemic shock and exhaustion asphyxia. Other possible contributing factors include dehydration, stress-induced arrhythmias, and congestive heart failure, with the rapid accumulation of pericardial and perhaps pleural effusion. Breaking the legs below the knees would lead to asphyxia death within minutes. Death by crucifixion was in every sense of the word excruciating. The Latin word excruciatus meant out of the cross. Since the Jews did not want the bodies to remain on the cross after sunset, the beginning of Sabbath, they asked Pontius Pilate to order the hastening of deaths of the 3 crucified men. The soldiers broke the legs of the 2 thieves, but when they came to Jesus and saw he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Rather, one of the soldiers pierced his side, probably with an infantry spear, which produced a sudden flow of blood and water. Soldiers are trained to check if the enemy is dead. I was in the Singapore Armed Forces for 2.5 years as part of a compulsory national enlistment. I remembered I was taught during my basic training on how to check for signs of life, usually movement and breathing. If we were not sure of whether an enemy was alive, we could kick, or we could attach a bayonet to the rifle to poke or stab the enemy. As a doctor, of course, checking for death was different. I would check for breathing, pulse, and look for fixed and dilated pupils. Christ spoke 7 times on the cross, 7 recorded times. Since speech occurs during exhalation, these short utterances must have been particularly difficult and painful for Jesus. At about 3 p.m. that Friday, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, bowed his head, and died. The Roman soldier, especially those watching over crucifixion, are professionals when checking for signs of life. That's why the soldiers did not fracture Jesus' legs. They have already determined that he was dead. And just like our modern soldiers, the soldier had a 1.5 to 1.8 meter spear which he used to confirm death by piercing. The Gospel of John describes the piercing of Jesus' side and emphasized the sudden flow of blood and water. Some have interpreted the flow of water to be ascites, or urine, from an abdominal midline perforation of the bladder. Traditionally, the spear wound was through the right side of the ribs, between the ribs, into the heart, in this direction. Between the ribs, into the right side of heart, somewhere in the right atrium and right ventricle. Therefore, the water probably represented serous, pleural, and pericardial fluid. The blood would have originated from the right atrium or the right ventricle. The cause of Jesus' death. Jesus died only after about 3 to 6 hours on the cross. That was relatively a quick death. The crucifixion process was meant to kill the criminal slowly over a few days. And after death, the body was kept on the cross for display for a few more days. All these to show the world what it meant to defy the Roman Empire. One popular explanation has been that Jesus died of cardiac rupture in the setting of the scourging and crucifixions, with associated hypovolemia, hypoxia, and perhaps an altered coagulable state. Friable thrombotic vegetations would have formed on the aortic or mitral valve. These then could have been dislodged and embolized into the coronary circulation, and thereby produce an acute transmural myocardial infarction. Thrombotic valvular vegetations have been reported to develop under analogous acute traumatic conditions. Rupture of the left ventricle free wall may occur, though uncommon, in the first few hours following infarction. Another explanation may be Jesus' death may have been hastened simply by a state of exhaustion and the severity of the scourging, with its resultant blood loss and pre-shock stage. The fact that he could not carry his patibulum or crossbar supports this interpretation. The actual cause of Jesus' death may have been multifactorial and related primarily to hypovolemic shock, exhaustion, asphyxia, and perhaps acute heart failure. A fatal cardiac arrhythmia may have accounted for the apparent catastrophic terminal event. It has always been unsettled how Jesus died. However, the important feature may not be in how he died, but rather whether he died. Clearly, the weight of historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted, and supports the traditional view that the spear, thrust between his right ribs, probably perforated not only the right lung but also the pericardium and heart, thereby ensured his death. Here I have my own explanation on how Jesus died. Jesus has said before his crucifixion in John 10:18, Jesus said, "No one takes it," meaning his life, "from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I receive from my Father." Reading the Gospels, you will note that Jesus was still able to drink and call in a loud voice just moments before he died. This is not a sign of a man in respiratory distress. I think Jesus willed his own spirit and body to separate. I want to emphasize this is not committing suicide. In fact, this is like the reverse of the creation of human life. Luke 23:46 accounts for Jesus' last moments. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he said this, he breathed his last. And compare this against Genesis chapter 2 verse 7. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Human life is different from all other forms of created life. It is the presence of a human body and a spirit residing inside. This was quite clearly stated in Genesis. I think death occurs when there's a separation of body and spirit. So when the body dies, the spirit will leave the body. Or once the spirit leaves the body will die. So when Jesus willed his spirit to leave his body died. Again, I emphasize this is not committing suicide. In committing suicide, the person kills the body and the spirit is forced to leave the body. And why this is not a sin is because Jesus said, "This is a command he has received from his Father, and he has authority to do it." I think it's quite obvious that Jesus timed his hour to be nailed at the cross at 9 a.m. and his death at 3 p.m. It was documented in the Gospels. Why did Jesus want to do that? I take this as explanation because I've researched this matter. I think because he wanted the time to be a witness that he was the true, unblemished, sacrificial lamb that takes away sins. The Passover sacrifice had already occurred before Jesus' crucifixion, but there was another sacrifice that occurred daily in the temple. In Numbers 28, God commanded a daily sacrifice known to the Jews as the Tamid. In Numbers chapter 28, God said to Moses, he wanted the Israelites to present 2 lambs that were a year old without defect as a burnt offering each day. 1 lamb in the morning and the other at twilight. Jesus was without defect. No sin, no broken bones. Tradition also has it that in the temple, the first lamb was sacrificed at 9 a.m. and the second at 3 p.m. Moreover, at 3 p.m., the priest, after sacrificing the second lamb, will say, "It is finished." At the same time, written in John 19:29, when he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." Thank you.